All right, Jamie, I got a question. What do second century Hellenistic overlords have in common with the Beach Boys?
I have no idea.
They get around.
Oh, oof.
I'm Joel Millen.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
So far, our story has featured a lot of mobility. Rulers and their armies, they're coming and going this way and that, north, south, east, west.
Sure.
We talked last time about the extent of the Seleucid Empire. I mean, there's a reason these guys have to get around. There's a lot of ground to cover. It stretches nearly 3,000 miles at its height from Sardis, Greece, all the way to Bactria, which is basically Afghanistan.
Okay.
Now, today, we're going to add even Rome to that mix. So if you just take it all together, we're talking about 4,000 miles that this book encompasses.
Well, speaking of getting around, how are people getting around here? I mean, this is way before planes, trains, and automobiles.
Yeah, they did have roads. If you think about it, like, if you're on your feet, you could just walk. You can't walk very far, though, if you don't have a road. And you sure can't carry stuff without a road because you're going to need animals that can carry things, carts that can carry things. Carts need roads.
Okay.
People have known this for a long time. Right. So like the Persians way back when, they had the royal road. And that was actually an extensive network of roads that snaked like thousands of kilometers from Greece all the way through into Persia.
Okay.
They had mile markers installed.
Really?
It was even subject to regular maintenance. So like these roads were very seriously guarded and taken care of. I mean, they had road crews, Well,
it seems like traveling that kind of distance on foot could take months, right?
Yeah, it did. But expert horsemen, they could travel immense distances in just days. In fact, Herodotus describes the Persian postal system in terms that sound almost like the American Pony Express. I'm just going to read this because This is kind of great. He says, there is nothing mortal that is faster, nothing living that is faster than the system the Persians have devised for sending messages. Apparently, they have horses and men posted at intervals along the route, the same number in total as the overall length in days of the journey, with a fresh horse and rider for every day of travel. Whatever the conditions, it may be snowing, raining, blazing hot, or dark, they never fail to complete their assigned journey in the fastest possible time. The first man passes his instruction on to the second, and the second on to the third, and so on. I mean,
wow,
that's incredibly amazing to imagine that kind of coordination and efficiency way back when.
I had no idea.
So the Persians, they needed this kind of connection. They needed this kind of communication across this kind of distance because they had so much territory. So in order to exert their control, they needed to have this kind of like networked system of roads and communication.
Sure.
However, like this is not a one-way street. It turns out that the very same roads they used to control their empire were the same roads that Alexander used to sprint all the way across their empire and take it.
Well, then what about the Seleucids? I mean, didn't they essentially have the same basic problem? We talked about that last time, and they basically took over where the Persians left off, and their empire was also quite massive.
Yeah, exactly. They used those roads and others to like essentially assert their control over these far-flung lands. And I just love saying far-flung. I mean, who doesn't? It's like one of those phrases that we need to figure out how to use more often. I was reading about this in Paul Cosman's book, The Land of the Elephant Kings. And he's got a whole section in there on basically this trick of travel. How do you manage it? What's it for? How did it work? And all of that. Primarily, it came down to this challenge of creating unity across a vast and wild diversity of land. And travel was the whole thing. He says the Seleucid monarchs restlessly crisscrossing their empire. That's how he refers to them. The hard thing was that when the king moved on, the impression of his authority that dissipated, that waned. So the king was always on the go. The king was always moving with like essentially a mobile court. He needed to like just make this circuit to constantly be reminding people that he was in charge. Cosman says this. He says, one way to conceive of the Seleucid kingdom is not as a static geography of regional core and increasingly graduated periphery. In other words, like you got a capital and you got like diffuse authority coming out from there, but as a system of imperial structures that could manifest centrality around the moving monarch.
Okay.
So this guy is like, the monarch is on the move and he's taking the kingdom with him, basically, his authority with him. And so making and maintaining roads was actually a sign of kingly authority. Okay. And we even pick up in this Cosman book an example of our friend Antiochus IV, actually the bad guy in our story. He was famous for beating back highway robbers on these roads through the Taurus Mountains. He made that safe. And he was then like, there was a statue erected in his honor and all of this, like maintaining and expanding the roads. That's like what kings did in this world.
Right. It's kind of amazing to think about today, but you know, these guys were actually traveling thousands of miles regularly.
Yeah. And in this chapter, like we said at the beginning, we're actually going to see some guys travel all the way to Rome. So like travel is just part of the ancient world. We may not think about it. Everything feels so tight and local, but no, I mean, this world is global. In the last episode, after Antiochus IV dies, there's a power struggle to figure out who's going to take over the Seleucid Empire. And that's still going on. But now we have a new character. So Demetrius. Now, Demetrius, he's the son of Seleucus IV. And we talked about that parade of patronymics, you know, these guys all named after each other, basically. And he has been a hostage in Rome. Antiochus originally was a hostage in Rome. He takes over the Seleucid Empire. Apparently that's the pipeline. So when Antiochus kicks the bucket, Demetrius leaves Rome and he decides to make a play for the Seleucid throne. He arrives in Antioch and he basically asserts his authority immediately and everyone goes along with it. And maybe this is because, you know, like Lysias and the rest of that crew, they're like a bunch of flunkies and they've utterly failed at, you know, convincing anybody that they're worthy of control. And so Demetrius, he arrives in Antioch. The army under his orders grabs Lysias and Antiochus V, and he orders them killed. And that's what happens. I mean, like these old guys that were causing us problems for all this time, they're just swept away. It's like out with the old, in with the new.
And despite what we might have picked up from the story so far, we might think that Israel is fully united in these campaigns, but it's not true. Israel is deeply divided right now. It might remind one of the American Revolution, like the Patriots versus the Tories. I mean, people were sometimes even opposed to their neighbors. This may be a little overly simplistic to say, but it's a little bit like the Hellenist party versus the Hasmoneans. And so far, you know, the Hellenists, what they have been focusing on is going along to get along, right? They're trying to conform, but now they're starting to step out of the shadows. And they've been a force in the story, but they really have not been central characters.
Right. There's like nobody really named on their side.
Yeah. And that changes with Alcimus, or would it be Alchemist? How would you say it?
Alcimus. I think it's Alcimus.
Okay, let's go with that.
We deliberated on it, ladies and gentlemen. We have decided it's Alcimus. So Alcimus does step out of the shadows with this power struggle happening in Antioch. The playing board is reset and he decides he wants to go in and make a move. He heads to Antioch and he makes an appeal to Demetrius for a new governor. And basically he says, look at the mess that Judas has made. You got to send somebody who can come clean this up. And so the king sends one of his friends. Oh no. Bacchides? How do you say this name?
Bacchides. There's a good one.
So the king sends one of his friends, Bacchides, to govern Judea. And here's what Alcimus was after all along. He gets appointed as high priest. So basically the king, he sees Alcimus as someone he can count on to back the Hellenist side. Yeah. And he wants him in charge to get control of everything. So Bacchides and Alcimus, they arrive with a large army and lots of, like flattering words of peace. Judas and his brothers, of course, they're like, they know better. You know, if something comes from Antioch, it's probably bad. And they pay no attention to what's been said here. They know that this is no good, especially since all these sweet words are backed up with a big army, you know? So they're like, no, we don't trust it. But other people do. You know, people are tired of the fight. People are tired of the war. People who are just trying to like get back to usual, get back to life. They're going to kind of like lean to compromise with the Hellenistic side of things. They may be Hellenists themselves, and they want peace. So they're willing to go along. And that even goes as so far as the Hasidians. They are actually deceived by Alcimus, and they decide to no longer associate with Judas. They decide to go along with the Hellenists.
Right. And at that point, Maccabees heads back to Antioch and leaves Alcimus in charge.
Right.
And it's not great, right? Alcimus exerts treacherous and violent control. And so what does Judas do? He gets the band back together and begins to oppose him.
He's got like we're on song, really. Fight the Seleucids, fight the Seleucids, fight. He could be a punk band. That could be the chorus.
So Alcimus heads back to Antioch to ask for help in dealing with Judas. Things are heating up.
Again. All right, Demetrius, he's ready to squash this thing. You know, we've been down this road before, but, you know, why not try it again? So he sends Nicanor. Now, we've talked about Nicanor before. He hasn't seen a lot of action, but here he is, and he's coming in big and strong now. Nicanor shows up, and he tries to reassert control, and it starts off, I don't know, dodgy. Starts off okay. Starts off like maybe it could work out, maybe it can't, but it definitely falls apart pretty quickly.
Yeah.
In fact, Nicanor ends up threatening the temple. And, you know, like the minute you go back into threatening the temple, that's kind of like, well, that's the one thing the Jews are in this for.
Right.
So this might have been the dumbest thing you could have done. And what happens next really comes down to two prayers. And the narrator specifically sets this up with a focus on these two prayers. The first prayer is from the priests, and I'll go ahead and read this.
Yeah.
You chose this house to be called by your name, they're praying to the Lord, and to be for your people a house of prayer and supplication. Take vengeance on this man and on his army, and let them fall by the sword. Remember their blasphemies, and let them live no longer. Now, that's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Judas has his own prayer. And Judas's prayer is informed by the history of the Jewish people. So when the armies square off now, Judas prays this. When the messengers from the king spoke blasphemy, your angel went out and struck down 185,000 of the Assyrians. So also crush this army before us today. Let the rest learn that Nicanor has spoken wickedly against the sanctuary, and judge him according to his wickedness.
The armies, they meet in battle, and guess who was first to fall? None other than Nicanor.
Ouch.
The narrator shows the Hasmonean cause was a people's cause. He said people came out of all the surrounding villages of Judea, and they outflanked the enemy and drove them back to their pursuers.
Wow.
So that they all fell by the sword. Not even one of them was left. Then the Jews seized the spoils and plunder. They cut off Nicanor's head and the right hand that he had so arrogantly stretched out, and brought them and displayed them just outside Jerusalem. Oh,
man. Oh, that's rough.
Yeah,
that is rough. When we mentioned the Tories versus the Patriots earlier. That actually, this scene here reminds me of like the British march back from Lexington and Concord, when the Americans, we can call them at that point, still British subjects at that point, but when the Americans were actually fighting the soldiers all the way back into Boston, and just, decimating them. That scene comes to mind, or that story comes to mind as I see this. You got the enemy in retreat, and the people, in other words, like, the common people are like coming out to to fight them along the way back as they retreat.
Yeah, and to them, God gave the victory to Judas.
Yep.
And they saw a clear and obvious punishment against Nicanor, this great blasphemer.
Right. Judas is here portrayed as the hero of his people and an uncompromising hero. Like you've got the people of Israel are at this point tired. Some of them are compromising, not Judas. He is like never going to give way on the temple. He's never going to give way with the right to worship the Lord as he understands they need to worship the Lord. But he needs help. He cannot possibly, this one guy and his people, even if he has so many of the people, which, the text that we just said is trying to indicate this is a people's cause.
Right.
Even if he has all of them, they cannot fight the Seleucid Empire on their own.
Yeah.
And so Judas makes a political move. He decides that, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That looks like Rome. And so he decides that if he can get the Romans to support them, then they will have the help that they need in order to push back the Seleucids, perhaps once and for all, but certainly in the meantime. And so while, whatever is left over of Nicanor's army is in retreat, Judas sends emissaries to Rome. And, it's a long trip. We've talked about the distance. The text even mentions the distance. It says, so Judas chose, another dangerously easily mispronounced name, So Judas chose, the text says, a guy whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but he's the son of John, who's the son of Achos, and Jason, the son of Eleazar, and he sent them to Rome to establish friendship and alliance, to free themselves from the yoke. So I'm quoting here, for they saw that the kingdom of the Greeks was enslaving Israel completely. They went to Rome, and then the text says a very long journey. So, we've seen a mobile people throughout this entire thing, but the hike to Rome, it's a bit of a journey. So they call it out.
And so after this long walk, they walked right into the Senate chambers. Yeah. And they asked to ally themselves with Rome. Now, we'll include the letter of agreement in the show notes, but the important thing to recognize here is that the Jews agree to help Rome, and Rome agrees to help the Jews. They formed an alliance. Yep. The Romans tell King Demetrius, why have you made your yoke heavy on our friends and allies, the Jews? If now they appeal again for help against you, we will defend their rights and fight you on sea and on land. So they've gone to bat for them.
Yeah. The trick, of course, is with that quid pro quo, this is going to bring Rome right smack dab in the middle of Israel. This is going to bring Roman interests, Roman concerns, Roman, life into the middle of Judea. It actually, we keep on bringing up the Tories and the Patriot stuff, but this actually reminds me of something George Washington would have called entangling alliances. So politics, it's messy. We need to do it. People feel the need to do it from time to time. This is one of those examples, but there are consequences which will eventually emerge.
While Judas's envoys are traveling back to Rome, news of Nicanor's defeat is getting back to Demetrius, and he's not.
All roads lead to Rome, but some of them lead to Antioch. That's what's happening here.
That is. And at that point, he's like, I have to send another army.
Yeah.
So he sends another army against Jerusalem. And this time they take another route. They come in from the north. They don't tell us exact figures of the army, but the Seleucid army is huge. And the problem is Judas only has 3,000 men on his side, and they're frightened.
In fact, they're so frightened, they're running away, right? Yeah. They start peeling off in the night. And it says that he only had 800 men when it was all said and done. My mind jumps back to that story of Gideon when, Gideon's got this big army and he's like, I don't need all these guys. We're going to do this the Lord's way. We're only going to have the true believers. And he starts sending guys home, right?
Yeah.
This is the opposite of what's happening here. Judas needs a big army. And his guys are peeling off, like not, he doesn't want that to happen, but that's what's happening. So they're running away, and Judas is like, he's discouraged. I mean, to say the least. In fact, what you actually get here is the sense that Judas knows it's over. The time is up. His time is up in particular. In fact, there's like this note of resignation here. He's got 800 guys. He has no time to go rally anymore. He just says, let us get up and go against our enemies. We may have the strength to fight them. We may. And note, let us get up. I mean, they are literally sitting down, laying down. They're like on the ground.
So it's not surprising that his men tried to talk him out of it.
No, they know what's happening.
But Judas shoots back at them. He says, far be it from us to do such a thing as to flee from them. If our time has come, let us die bravely for our kindred and leave no cause to question our honor.
Wow. He knows he's going to die.
Yeah.
And his men know too, and they're actually willing to go with him, which says a lot. They put up a valiant fight. The narrator says the battle raged from morning until evening. But ultimately, Judas, the hero of our story up to this point, falls. He dies. And what's left of his men retreat.
The narrator says, then Jonathan and Simon took their brother Judas and buried him in the tomb of their ancestors at Modin and wept for him. All Israel made great lamentation for him. They mourned for many days and said, how is the mighty fallen, the savior of Israel?
Wow. First off, that's a direct echo, right, of David's elegy for Saul and Jonathan.
Yeah.
But note that title, Judas Maccabeus, the savior of Israel. Like, he is seen as someone who's just like David, someone who's like just like any one of these grand historic kings. And the text goes on to say something, picks up a note of something that would immediately draw any reader's mind back to all those kings, which is to say, what about all the other deeds of Judas Maccabeus? Like, they're recorded. Like, you pick that up in Kings and Chronicles, especially, like this whole idea of they've done way more and we've got it on record. Their fame has been preserved. And so there's like a direct callback, not only to David, but the whole like royal line of Israel here.
Now, at this moment in the story, it starts to feel like the good guys are lost. The Hellenizers are coming back. The text actually says all the wrongdoers reappeared.
All of them.
Yeah. Guess who's back? And it's not great. So Maccabees is flexing after his victory, and he's going after anyone at all who was allied to Judas. They've got a target on their back, and he's going for him.
Yep.
The Jews, they needed a new leader. So they appointed Judas's brother, Jonathan.
Judas is a military hero. And Jonathan, he's got some military chops too, but actually what we'll see with his reign, which is long. Jonathan steps in 160 BC and he runs the show for 18 years, all the way till 142 BC. So, that's pretty lengthy. He does this, by the way, not just as a military hero, but also as a diplomatic hero, as a political hero, which is a new thing here. We saw a little bit of that with Judas. We're going to see more of that with Jonathan.
Yeah.
And it's under Jonathan that the Jews, ultimately win their religious autonomy and their political sovereignty. The Navarre Bible has a good summary of this here that shows the complexity of his rule, but what it attained. It says, with Jonathan as their leader, the Jews won not only religious autonomy, but political sovereignty. However, they became enmeshed in Syrian politics. Jonathan's remarkable switching of allegiance shows his realism and political astuteness. God uses him to guide his people's fortunes. So this is what life looks like on the ground. It can be messy, and we're getting ready to see some of that in these next chapters. Yeah. But Jonathan comes to the fore. and his reign is powerful and successful.
When Bacchides hears about this, he's not happy. He wants to squash Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
So Jonathan and his brother Simon and a few others, they take off. They go hide out in the wilderness.
This is actually, like something we see at the very beginning with their father, Mattathias, right? When the Seleucids first come, like he has to go on the lam. It's kind of like that's where we're at again. We're starting from ground zero, basically.
Bacchides is after them, and it's getting messy. I mean, the text is wild, as we've come to expect from First Maccabees. A wedding turns into a funeral. The whole night, it's bad. Bacchides comes with a large force on the Sabbath day, it says, comes right up to the bank of the Jordan. They end up fighting with Bacchides, and it says about 1,000 of his men fell that day. And then Jonathan and his guys, they swam across the Jordan.
They're like, get us out of here. Bacchides has not defeated Jonathan, but he's got him on the run. So he goes back to Jerusalem and sends his men out to fortify the area. He places garrisons up and down, the stretch to harass Israel. He fortifies this town, that town. And the whole idea is that he is going to exert his control over the whole area. He even takes the sons of the leading men and basically keeps them as hostages. And, you remember Demetrius was held as a hostage back in Rome. Antiochus the fourth was held as a hostage back in Rome. He's using that tactic right here.
Sure.
So if you want your people to live, you won't attack me. That's the basic idea here. Here's where it starts getting really squirrely. When Nicanor arrives and threatens the temple, the Jews, they rally and they defeat Nicanor. Alcimus does his own version of that, only it's even worse. Are you ready for this? It says that he gave orders to tear down the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary. Now, what does it mean that he wants to tear down this wall? The Navarre Bible says this, that there's a note there that says Alcimus's attempt to merge Jews and Gentiles was not the way to create a unified people. What? That's happening. That's what's doing there. Yes.
Yeah.
By breaking down that wall, he's essentially saying we're all here together. There is no separation. The narrator of First Maccabees calls this, like a desecration of the work of the prophets. Now, obviously, the prophets didn't erect that wall, but the idea here is iconographic. That wall represents something, and that's exactly why Alcimus is destroying it, and that's exactly what happens to him.
So Alcimus begins tearing down the wall, and in the process, he gets sick. It actually says he stopped, like he was paralyzed, and he couldn't even give a word or command concerning anything in his house, it says. He just lost control, and then soon after, he died.
Wow. The whole thing falls apart. His whole little mission of putting himself in charge, running the show the way he wants to run it underneath the overlordship of the Seleucids. It's all over for Alcimus.
Yeah. And so Bacchides sees this and he decides to back off. And the text says that they got 2 years of rest in the land.
Wow. Bonus. That 2-year period must have felt amazing. But this is First Maccabees. Is it going to last? No, it's not going to last. The Hellenizing Jews, they're like, Jonathan's kicking back, living in luxury over here, totally calm, confident, thumbing his nose at the Seleucids. We got to bring Bacchides back and take him down. And so they consulted with Bacchides, and he's like, yeah, it's time. I'm coming back. So he brings a big army, and basically he sends letters to all of his allies in Judea. And he's like, all right, now it's time. The pincer move is on. We're going to take him down. But Jonathan figures this out. The plan became known, the narrator says. And so Jonathan's men seized 50 of the guys who were trying to orchestrate this coup, basically. and they just snuffed him out. They killed him.
Snuffed
Him out and killed him. And again, that's how this whole book goes. This is all feeling very Martin Scorsese at this point.
Yeah.
It's like every time you turn around, somebody's overstepping, and then whack, they get it. But it ultimately comes down to a fight with Bacchides. Bacchides loses, and he loses so bad. He's just ticked as all get out that the Jews brought him back at all. And so he rounds up the people that counseled him to come back to Judea and fight with Jonathan, and he just kills them now. So he's like, I can't believe you got me into this again. You're done to me. You're dead to me. So he kills him. And then he goes back to Antioch. He's like, I'm through with this place. You people are nothing but trouble. Jonathan, of course, hears this news. He's excited. He sends ambassadors to Bacchides to make peace and to release the captives. Bacchides agrees and basically says, I'm not going to do anything else to you as long as I live.
The chapter concludes with this. Thus the sword ceased from Israel, and Jonathan dwelt in Michmash. And Jonathan began to judge the people, and he destroyed the ungodly out of Israel. There's a sense in which he's risen up like the great old judges of Israel, and he himself now has emerged as a leader of the people. That's a good spot to stop. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review. Take some time to look up badbooksofthebible.com. And right there, you can do a lot of things. You can subscribe to our newsletter. You can find the link to follow our tweets. And you can also see where to share our podcast. I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when Jonathan gets a promotion.